I know that a lot of people consider this Pokemon species to be the more boring, weaker version of the Seel line. I mean, I can't deny that I think Seel is cuter, but that may be personal bias. In reality, they are so similar that they could nearly be exchanged with one another. Their enclosures are very similar, their diets are very similar, and even how they interact with one another is extremely similar. But the Seel line can be interesting to keep and house in their own rights if you only take the time to look at them. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about Seel and its evolution Dewgong. I should say that I did make a minor mistake in my last guide. I said Seel was an ice water type. It's actually just a water type. Dewgong is the only one in the line that gains the ice typing. Sorry about that. But Seel itself has a tube-like body with its head and flippers at one end and the tail at the other. Its mouth is a cream color that stands out against the white of the rest of its body, and it has a horn on the top of its head that it uses to crack through ice, along with two tusks on its lower lip. But this description doesn't do it justice on just how big a Seel is. These guys are an average of 3 feet 7 inches long and just under 200 pounds. And its evolution Dewgong is even larger, now being 5 feet 7 inches and weighing 260 pounds. Dewgong keeps the same general body shape and plan as Seel, but its front and back flippers are much more elegant and flowing, almost like dress fabric. Its entire body, including its mouth now, is a pure white color, and its eyes are much larger than Seel's. In all, while it is a simple Pokemon, it's also a very beautiful one as well, especially if you can watch them while they swim. And if you happen to think so, then let's get into it and find out if these could be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. This is our first oceanic Pokemon, and while it's not a fish and doesn't have gills, you will need to give it a ton of space to swim. This is important for its exercise as well as its mental well-being. These Pokemon don't often feel comfortable on land unless it's right next to the ocean. They are very clumsy and slow on land, which makes them easy prey to predators. But they're also not fully aquatic. They need to be able to haul themselves onto land to rest and sleep and digest food. So the enclosure is going to be split between the water and the dry land where they can rest. As far as I can tell after talking with experts and researching guidelines, which is harder than you would think, you're looking at a pool that has a minimum volume of 367 cubic meters. This is enough to house at most 6 Seels or up to 3 Dewgongs, while still allowing them room to get away from one another if needed, which we'll cover later on in this section. The walls of the tank should be made of something sturdy enough that it can take being rammed by these Pokemon's horns, and not being porous enough that the water will enter the material. The best uses are high-grade glass, which is what I use for my Seel enclosure, or something along the same lines. The pool should be circular in shape, as that's the best for water circulation, and you will also want to have a filtration and circulation system in place to help keep the water from becoming too disgusting or stagnant. And you're going to want a really good system considering the size of the pool. In the same vein as that, you'll also want to have a system that'll help keep the water cold. These Pokemon do best in temperatures that are below freezing, as cold as you can get it. If they start getting too warm, it can lead to lethargy, overheating, and eventually sickness. So keeping the water as cold as possible without having it freeze is a must for these guys. Along the bottom of the tank, you should also have some decorations, like rock outcroppings and some plants. Not only will this allow your Pokemon to better feel at ease in their tank, but it will also give your Pokemon some enrichment as they swim around and through the decorations. Moving to the dry land section, these don't have to be as complex as the pool. They can be a simple concrete section that are epoxy sealed, as that'll make them easy to clean, very resistant to wear and tear, and it will also be easy to keep them cool for your Pokemon. Just be sure that you keep the concrete cold, but not too cold. These Pokemon often come to dry land to sleep and digest their food, and they need a warmer surface to lay on to aid in their digestion. The main concern you should have when it comes to these dry sections is the ease of access to the water. Both Seel and Dewgong are not very good climbers, and while they can jump from the water if they want to, they would need a lot of momentum, and if they miss, then they could end up hurting themselves on the edge of the concrete. So when you make the dry land sections of the enclosure, you want to make sure that you have ramps that come down into the water, providing a gentle slope upward that your Pokemon will be able to shimmy and scoot their way up. As for how much space you'll need for the dry sections, you'll need a minimum of 30 square meters as a baseline, and for any Pokemon above the first one, you should add on an extra 5 square meters. Now, you can do all of this in one big area, but I would recommend that you instead break it up. Make the dry land parts oddly shaped, separate them into 2 different disconnected pieces on either side of the pool, something to make it so that if one of your Pokemon needs to or wants to get away from the others in their enclosure, they have a dry area space where they can go to do so, which, again, we'll talk about that in a bit. And the last thing for the dry sections of the enclosure is to make sure that they stay cold as well. They should be warmer than the water, as they do use the warmer temperatures to help digest and it helps them to sleep, but it's not going to be what you and I would consider warm. It's warm relative to the Pokemon and to the water. Thankfully, with the cold water right there next to the concrete, that should help it stay relatively cool without you having to do too much. Okay, let's talk about housing other Pokemon with your Seel evolution, and that whole needing to get away thing that I've mentioned a few times already. The first thing that you have to know for these guys is that they are very social Pokemon. They oftentimes are found in large packs out on the oceanic ice, and need that social interaction with their own species for proper mental development and stress management. To that end, you have to keep them in groups of at least 4 to 5 individuals. Mind you, that doesn't have to be all Seals or all Dewgongs. In fact, it's best if you mix it up, allowing for natural interaction between younger and older members of the same species, as well as the easy establishment of a social hierarchical system. These Pokemon, while needing to have others of their own species around, are also very intra-competitive species, and will constantly vie among themselves for dominance. This will mostly be confined to the separate sexes, males competing with males and females competing with females, with the males, of course, being a bit more competitive on average, but there have absolutely been cases of both sexes challenging each other. I want to remind you that these are just dominance displays in competition, not actual aggression. For now, remember that these fights are just to see who's in charge. The Pokemon do not want to injure each other here. But that's why the ability to get away from each other is so important in their enclosure. If a Seel or Dewgong that loses its dominance competition can't get away from the winner, it'll feel like it's trapped next to this bigger, stronger Pokemon, and that could very well cause it to panic and actually attack. And since the dominance behavior is needed for these guys to function with each other, and they need each other to be able to develop mentally, it means you have to be sure to keep any fights from breaking out. Long story short, they can and need to be housed with others of their own species, so just get ready for some of them to start screaming at each other and metaphorically thumping their chests at each other. As for Pokemon that can be housed with them, the Seel line can be housed with them pretty easily, as they have a very similar enclosure setup. Just be sure that you greatly expand the enclosure to accommodate them. They have a very similar social structure to the Seel line, and when you combine them all in one enclosure, then things can get kinda tense. But aside from that, as long as they have adequate space, the Seel line can get along with them very well. The Popplio line could also technically be housed with them, but the Popplio line prefers much warmer temperatures, so you'll have to warm up the enclosure. Which Seel could handle, but it wouldn't be ideal. After that, I wouldn't house any fish-like Pokemon with them, seeing as these guys are carnivorous and would most likely eat anything they could catch. And most of the things that they wouldn't be able to eat would either try to eat them or need a very different enclosure setup. In the end, I would stick with others of the same species and maybe the Seel line if you want to mix it up a bit. Availability. What really limits these Pokemon on habitats is the fact that they need a cold, oceanic environment that isn't just deep ocean. And there aren't many places like that in the Pokemon world. Of course, they are most well known for thriving at the Sea Foam and Whirl Islands in Kanto and Johto respectively, but they also exist in the large bay on Sinnoh's northern island, and in the shallower waters of the Great Chasm in Unova. Interestingly enough, they also seem to have adapted to cave life in their pursuit of the cold. You can see this in the Sinnoh Victory Road, and surprisingly enough in the Seaward Cave in Alola. I figured it would be too warm there for these Pokemon, but the cave keeps things cool enough that they can live just fine. There are some reports of them around Shoal Cave in Hoenn, which does make sense. If it's a great environment for Seel, then it would be a great environment for Seel and Dewgong. But I couldn't find anything concrete on that, so don't take that as a solid fact. And if you're hoping to find them in the Galar or the Paldea regions, then I'm sorry, but no luck. There are no native populations in those regions. As for the breeder scene, there aren't really that many people that have made investment in raising and caring for these guys. Minor spoiler, but the Enclosure is not cheap, and neither are the Pokemon. So to have a stable breeding population of these guys is a heavy investment for anyone. Plus, these guys aren't nearly as popular as the other pinniped Pokemon like Seel and Popplio. A lot of people consider these guys to be boring when compared with them, and so because of the lack of popularity, not many people are raising them. As well, due to their enclosure needs, it's often places like aquariums and Pokemon gyms that do have these Pokemon. And the fact that you need a group of them is just a cherry on top of the sundae. So, if you're hoping to get these Pokemon through captivity, you're going to have a hard time getting a hold of someone that can help you. I'm not saying there's nobody, but it's going to be a lot harder than most other common Pokemon, and even harder than other Seel-type Pokemon like Seel and Popplio. Catchability. The cold and the water are going to be your major obstacles to being able to catch these guys. When traveling out to catch these Pokemon, you are going to be going to places that are cold, so be sure to dress warm. You want thick layers and water-repellent jackets and pants because hypothermia is a very real threat. As well, if these Pokemon are swimming in the ocean, you should not go in after them and try to catch them there. Not only is the water most likely cold enough to send your body into shock, but these Pokemon are not the only ones in the ocean. There are all kinds of oceanic horrors that are down there, and humans are not designed to be in the open ocean. It's just not a good place. Okay, I'm good. Your best bet to catch these Pokemon is to try during the day, as they are nocturnal and tend to rest on the land during the day. Sneak up on them and try to get as close as possible without alerting the Pokemon before you throw your ball. If you do alert them, you shouldn't be in too much danger, as they'll most likely dive into the water that's nearby instead of attacking. The only risk of that is if you find a group that has some very territorial individuals in it. As long as you have a decently strong Pokemon with you, then you should be able to drive off any Pokemon that gets uppity though. As for what balls you should use, a Great Ball would be best for Seel, and an Ultra Ball would be best for Dewgong. Care. Because of how cute they are and their unassuming demeanor, it comes as a surprise to many people that these Pokemon are pure carnivores. More specifically, they're piscivores, which means they feed only on aquatic prey. Which makes sense when you think about where these Pokemon live. Veggies and plants don't often grow in the cold, icy environments that these Pokemon frequent, which means that you will need to feed these Pokemon fish. Thankfully, they don't have to be live, but feeding sessions will greatly involve the handler, which means you. Because You see, the best way to feed these Pokemon is by hand, by bringing in a full fish, usually in a bucket, and giving them to the Pokemon. This will pull double duty, as not only are you feeding the Pokemon, but you're also building trust between you and the Pokemon. As you give the food to the Pokemon, they'll start to associate you with the positive sensation of being fed, and that will lead to them trusting you more as time goes on. But let's for now stick with the food. The amount that you're going to feed them per Pokemon is between 3.5 and 4.5 pounds of fish per Seel, and between 8 and 12 pounds of food per Dewgong per feeding. The best feeders for this are going to be Solo Wishy-Washy and Barboach, as they are small enough that you can feed the whole fish to your Pokemon, which is good because then they get all the nutrition they can from the prey, and their systems are designed to be able to handle things like bones and scales. You could also supplement this diet with a mixture of other kinds of meat like Magikarp, Basculin, or even some crustacean meat like Krabby or Shelder. It's important to have a variety of meats, as that way they can get a lot of different nutrients from a lot of different meat sources. As well, and this is going to sound a little weird, but you also want to add in some ice cubes to their food. Most of the way these Pokemon get water in their diet is through their food. And with the fish being frozen and then thawed, there should be plenty of water content within the fish. But just to make sure, you could also take some ice cubes and mix it in with their food, just as a way to get some extra water into their diet. To encourage them to eat the ice cubes, you could also mix in some fish blood or small pieces of meat into the ice, just as extra encouragement. When prepping the food for them, you should be keeping the fish frozen so that they don't go bad, and then thaw out what you'll need for the next feeding. For these Pokemon, there'll be 2 feedings per day. However, as they are nocturnal, you'll be feeding them breakfast shortly after sunset wherever you live, and then feeding them dinner shortly before sunrise. It has to be this way so that they can use the warmth from the sun to help them digest what they've eaten through the night, which unfortunately means that your sleep schedule is going to end up circulating around these Pokemon's awake schedule. How you feed them is that you bring the prey in some sort of container, like a bucket as I said earlier, and the Pokemon should smell the food and come over to you. If the Pokemon are still new to you, they may be a bit wary around you, which is fine. In those cases, you want to grab a fish or a piece of meat and gently toss them to the Pokemon. They may or may not catch them out of the air, which is fine, that's a sort of enrichment for them in and of itself, but either way, that's the best way to feed them if they won't come close to you. Over time, or if you end up getting one that's used to people from the beginning, they should approach you when you come in with the food. At that point, you should be able to just give the Pokemon food directly from your hand. This is why I recommended smaller prey fish for them, as they'll be easier for them to take whole from your hand and to swallow. When they begin to take the food from your hand, you want to start trying to reach out and pet them, or scratch them, or touch them in some way. They may shy away from you if they still aren't used to you yet, but continue to reward positive interaction with the food, and over time they'll grow to be more accustomed to you being there, and eventually they will allow you to start physically interacting with them. At this point, you have the basics down for training these Pokemon, but you can absolutely go further with this if you want to. I'm sure we've all seen examples at the zoo or the aquarium of trainers putting on shows with these kind of Pokemon where they have them do tricks or touch a ball with their nose or what have you. These are all things that you can absolutely do with your Seel evolution, but I won't be going into that in this guide, as that is way beyond what you need to care for these guys. If you're going to leave it at what I've given you in this guide, then you should build up a wonderful, friendly relationship with these Pokemon, to the point where you could probably hang out in the enclosure for a little bit with them and it would be fine. The only thing I should mention here is that these Pokemon may not eat every meal, as they'll periodically go through small bouts of fasting in the wild, and have been known to do so in captivity. So if they miss 1 or even 2 meals, then don't panic. See if they'll eat the next day, and then if they don't eat then, I would talk to your Pokemon Center to see if something is wrong. The last thing you should keep in mind with these Pokemon for their care is enrichment. I know I mentioned this slightly in the enclosure when talking about the decorations, but these Pokemon are very inquisitive and playful, so boredom is a very real thing for these guys. So you want to have certain ways to engage with them and entertain them. One simple option is toys. Get them some pool toys that are sturdy enough for them to roughhouse with. An intriguing idea I saw online is that some people will use ice for this. They'll take a feeder fish and freeze it into either a block or a ball or something like that, and they'll toss that into the pool. That way the Pokemon will engage with it, trying to figure out how they're going to get the food out of the ice. Training is, of course, also a good method of enrichment, but just having people come by and enter the enclosure can be a great source of enrichment just in and of itself. Once your Pokemon are used to you being around and interacting with them, start to bring different people around. Your mom, your dad, siblings, friends. People that these Pokemon either haven't seen or don't see often will really engage that curious side of them and give them a bit of mental exercise. And that's what this is really about. You want to keep these Pokemon both mentally and physically active and engaged with their environment. Cost. Considering the fact that you're really only going to be getting these Pokemon from the wild, then I'm tempted to put these guys in the moderate category. You will have to travel to get them, especially if you live in a region that doesn't have a native population of them, but that shouldn't be too bad. What will really cost you a lot is the gear you'll need to deal with the environment and the balls you'll need to use to catch them. If you're getting your Seel evolution from captivity, then you're going to be squarely in the very high category. The enclosure will be nothing short of the very high category. Aquariums and pools are always expensive, and when you need something of this size and complexity for multiple Pokemon, it's going to be a hit to your wallet. Your best bet is to find a company that can come out and set this enclosure up for you, as they oftentimes do have deals. Lastly, the food will be in the very high category as well. Because of the fact that they need only meat, and not only meat but fish, it's going to mean you're going to be spending a lot. It will be cheaper than it could be, as they're fish that are not very popular for pets or for people to eat, but you're still going to be spending a lot of money to keep these Pokemon fed. Conclusion. I think this perfectly shows why oceanic Pokemon, even those that aren't fully aquatic like the Seel line, are so hard to care for. They need a massive investment in space and food, and the fact that these guys are social so you need multiples of them doesn't help matters. The only saving grace I can see for Seel and Dewgong are that they are very easy to train, and you can actually hang out with them in their enclosure if you want to. That's not something you can say for a lot of different kinds of Pokemon. I mean, I love my Seels, but they have the exact same issues as this line. But if you have the space and the disposable income to handle them, then these friendly, cold-loving Pokemon could easily be the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we cover the toxic sludge Pokemon Grimer and its evolution Muck. Have a wonderful night, everyone.